Hi, good afternoon. I'm Fran Stevens. I'm the Director for Pre-Award Services. And this is usually kind of a long session for us, so I'm going to go ahead and just roll right into it. Please feel free at any time to stop me if you have questions or don't understand something. So these are the things we're going to go into, some things to think about as you're building your budget, especially like the federal cost principles. And then we're going to go through like the different components of most of the regular budget, some things to know about what's normally an expenditure on that particular category of spending, and then some common issues or problems that we see on some of the budgets that we handle. So some of the things that you want to keep in mind are that a good budget at the proposal stage is something that you'll be able to use on the actual project accomplishment, and it complies with whatever the sponsor guidelines are. You have to be aware of whatever limitations are in the solicitation, because sometimes they can restrict indirect cost, or they can prescribe that you have to do certain things like travel for a particular meeting to some location. We're hoping that the budget that you make at the proposal stage is actually the one that you'll be able to use when the award is funded. Although we know going into it that it's your best guess at this stage, and there could be a lot of changes, or it's very likely that the sponsor may come back and may want you to adjust the budget, like they may ask you to revise down 10 or 20%. There are a lot of different types of proposals that go out there, and sometimes the type of proposal that you're doing will have an impact on the categories of spending and the elements that you have in the proposal that you're building. So some of the different types that we normally see are federal proposals, non-federal proposals that could be going to a state or a foundation or a company. We do have some international proposals that go out, or subcontracts. You could be a subcontract to another university or organization's proposal where they're going to send money to you. And you may also have subcontracts or subawards on your budget where, let's say you have a PI at Oklahoma State University who's going to be doing a component of work, and so they're going to have some money for their university on your budget. We also have internal awards that sometimes you have to develop a budget for. So we're going to go over some of the different federal cost principles. So all the proposals that go in for federal awards have to abide by the federal cost principles. And they always want to know that the federal spending is on equal footing with any spending that you're doing with anybody else. And we'll talk more about this in a minute. A lot of nonprofits and other organizations also follow these federal principles because they're just considered good business practice for doing your proposal work. So in the federal government, they have these things called circulars. They're put out by the Office of Management and Budget, and they give you the guidelines for just general practices. For example, you can't have alcohol on a proposal that's paid for by the federal government unless you're doing alcohol related research. So they just have a whole bunch of rules, like things about that. They took a lot of the circulars and they combined them into one area. So now they're under the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR Title II. But you may still hear people talk about these, especially if you're dealing with an older PI or if you're looking at older guidelines. And so here you see the new Code of Federal Regulations area where it's at, and the old circular number in case that ever comes up where you can easily find it. So in 2014, all of the old circulars were combined into one. So they took 8 circulars and combined it into one, and that's how they came up with Circular A81. They combined 8 into one. It's also called the Uniform Guidance, or the UG. So you'll see that referred to sometimes in your solicitations or the general proposal guidance that you have from the different agencies. They'll say something about complying with the uniform guidance, or they'll reference that 2 CFR number. So you have direct and indirect cost on your budget. So we're going to kind of explain that a little bit. A direct cost is where you can identify an expense specifically to whatever work it is that's being done. And it has to be able to be assigned with a pretty good degree of accuracy. And it has to be allowable, allocable, reasonable, and have consistent treatment to all the sponsors that you submit with. We're going to go through each of those a little bit. So allowable means, is it an actual project related expense? So you can't have something on your budget thinking, oh, I'd like to travel to San Francisco to visit my relatives, and I'm just going to put that on this budget. There has to be something that you're going to be doing related to the actual accomplishment of the project that you're putting in for. Does it comply with the sponsor guidelines? So if the sponsor said you could only have 1 month of salary, did you only put 1 month of salary down? If you put 2 months, then it wouldn't be allowable because the sponsor restricted you. Does it comply with any institutional policies that you had? So if OU said that you had to use a certain mile rates per mile charge, if you didn't use that, then that charge wouldn't be an allowable charge. And we'll talk about mileage in a little bit too. So the basic thing to keep in mind on allowable is it legal for you to actually spend that money for this project based on the parameters that you are given to operate within? So allocable. Allocable means, can you assign that expense to that particular project? A lot of times we see issues with this where a PI will think that, for example, they have 2 grants from NSF. So both pots of money are coming from NSF, so it doesn't make a big difference if I put my travel on this grant versus putting it on this grant. Well, yes, you can only put charges related to the work that's being done to the project that is supposed to go with. That's what it's allocable to. So even if it's coming from the same agency, you can't mix pots of funds to accomplish things. If you have something where there is a shared cost, you have to figure out a way to track that so that you can show auditors or the sponsor that you have taken into consideration that this is a shared cost and how you were going to figure it. So for an example, if you were doing a telephone survey on 2 different proposals, how would you calculate how much the cost was for each one? Well, you might have a log where you record how many phone calls are made on one proposal versus another one, and then that's how you extrapolate your cost for the phone. So it's very common to see that in relationship to like printing charges and things like that, where if you have handouts or something that you're doing for 2 different proposals, how are you keeping those costs separate? You can't shift costs from one project to another project because you're starting to run out of money, or it's just more convenient because it's less paperwork for you to do. Those reasons won't stand up when an auditor comes and asks you questions. So you have to go through whatever it takes to divide the cost and assign them to the correct place that they need to be assigned. Is the cost reasonable? Would an average person think that this was a reasonable amount of money to spend for something? And where we sometimes see issues with this is, for example, if you're dealing with a piece of special test equipment and it has to be in a hardened case or something because you're taking it out into a field to use, then you might have to put a little justification note with that expense explaining that it was like $10,000 or $20,000 more than normal because it had to be in this special hardened case or something like that. So when you're looking at expenses, you want to kind of keep in mind, what would this normally cost, or how would someone normally consider this? Would it raise their eyebrows? A good example that I know happened on this was someone turned in an expense for a box of condoms. It was a graduate student, and there was nothing in the proposal that they were doing that was related to sex or a sex study. Well, they got asking questions and they found out that they were using them to feed leeches because they were a natural. So the leeches would attach to them. They lived longer because they were eating better. So they were able to justify the expense, but they had to put some notes on the receipt explaining what they were doing, because that was a big flag and people were like, well, what's this graduate student turning in this receipt? Are the costs consistently treated? So what the federal government doesn't want to find out if they come in and they look at your records is that you charge them $1,000 to do something that you charged your buddy Joe down the street $200 to do. So any cost that you have, like if you're running a test for something, have to be consistently treated from one type of sponsor to another. A common misconception that people have when auditors come in is that they can only look at the funds that you got from them. Because of this federal cost principles, they can look at anything that they want to look at because they can compare how you're treating their costs versus how you're treating everybody else's. So we talked about direct cost. The other big cost component is indirect cost, which is also called facilities and administrative cost. And these are things that can't be allocated specifically to a project very easily. They're things like lab space, your lights that you have on, custodial support, HR support, if you might use resources in a library, how that might be accounted for. If there's things within your lab that are hard to get an amount on, like maybe you have gas hookup and stuff or gases that you normally use in your testing, and you don't want to have to like measure units for each type of test that you do. So that's all part of your indirect cost. Companies will call this their overhead. So in your budget components, what the sponsor wants to see in your budget is the items that they want you to provide cost estimates on can vary from sponsor to sponsor. Depending on where you're at, local policy can drive what your budget looks like because they may want special or certain object codes used in your spending. So at OU, we do use object codes when it comes to the spending. The budget that we prefer everybody to use is an OU internal spreadsheet. And it's pretty much based on an NSF general budget. And it's one of the handouts that you have. And we'll be referring back to it. The reason we use this is that these cost categories are pretty much similar to just about every sponsor. Some sponsors will kind of lump some together or want to see certain charges in one area versus another. And we're going to go through each of these a little bit and talk a little bit about what we commonly see in one area versus another area, or some flags where you might want to be aware of. So the first area is section A. This is your senior personnel and other personnel cost. It's broken down by either academic year or summer year. On the spreadsheet that you're looking at, you see where it says 9 or 12. That's you can change to show the appointment of the person. And if you do, it'll automatically calculate their salary correctly based on the number of months and the effort that you put in. Postdocs, professional staff, anybody that that you have that is at OU Norman that is going to be working on the budget, on the project. Your graduate students, full-time appointment on a grant for a graduate student is considered to be 50% effort. It could be semester, it could be 9-month, it could be 12-month. That's however you want to appoint them. And we'll talk about how that impacts tuition in a little bit. One of the red flags in this area is clerical support. So your secretary or administrative support. It used to be that you couldn't have clerical support at all, especially if it was someone who was already paid through the university's funds. They started loosening up on that a little bit and saying if you had a lot of paperwork and things like that, where you could justify that you were going to be having a lot of extra time out of the normal work environment of the administrative staff that the department had, that you could put that in the budget. So that's kind of where we stand right now. If you have a high level of support that's going to be needed, or if it's a very large project like a central project or something like that, then you can put clerical support in there. You just have to justify it. We usually tell people if you think that you have a small component, like maybe you need some assistance handling travel arrangements or something like that, instead of putting it on the clerical line, put it in the other line and note that it's like a project coordinator or something like that. And then you don't raise the red flag where an auditor might look and say, hey, you've got administrative support in here, and come and ask questions. So this is a breakdown of what's normally involved in your fringe benefit rate. Some institutions do treat tuition as part of a fringe benefit. We handle it separately in our budgets. There are a couple of sponsors, though, that they consider the tuition to be a benefit, and so we'll have to roll that up into the budget that we submit for them. Let me go back to that. So the rate of your fringe benefit is based on what your appointment is. If you're a senior personnel, a faculty person, and there are a few like the research scientists, they don't take the teacher's retirement system. So if that's the case, you need to let the person who's helping you within the Office of Research Services know so that they can tailor your budget, because our budgets are automatically set to default to the higher fringe benefit rate. And that's to help protect you all, because if you go in at the higher rate and it turns out that the person's actually not taking OTRS, so they have a lower rate, then you have a little bit of money that you can play with. But if you go in at a lower rate and then it turns out they are really receiving the higher rate, we have to pay them at the rate they're actually appointed at. And so then you have to take the funds out of someplace else in your budget to cover that. It is not normally on the budget spreadsheet that you're given, but if you have someone who's only part-time, we can set one of the cells up to calculate the part-time fringe for you. You just need to let somebody in our office know so we can modify the spreadsheet for you. And I would mention too that these spreadsheets are available all the time on our website under grants, the budget development area. So if you, like on the weekend, decide you want to pull some numbers together, you can do that without contacting somebody in our office. But if you contact our office or submit an information sheet to let us know that you're starting to think about doing a proposal, we'll go through the guidelines and we'll set everything up on this spreadsheet to match whatever the sponsor requirements are. So if it has a limited indirect cost rate, we'll go ahead and make that on there for you. If if we see notes where like they are requiring travel or restricting travel or something like that, we'll put those notes for you on the side so that it reminds you to keep that in mind while you're coming together with your numbers. So the definition for equipment for federal is an item having a value of $5,000 or more in a year and at least a year's life expectancy of use. Some sponsors, especially if it's a state agency, define that differently. So within Oklahoma, I can't remember if it's 300 or 500, but most of the state agencies define equipment that way. So if the sponsor defines it differently than the federal government does, we follow the sponsor's definition. Equipment usually can include freight and shipping costs. It can include training and installation of the equipment. So normally what we assume is if they don't spell it out in the guidelines, then you can include those costs. Sometimes it can include construction and remodeling costs too. It depends on if the sponsor has provided any information about that. You note that it says fabricated equipment. So this is if you were making like a test set or some type of special test assembly and you're putting the components together. And the components are less than $5,000. So like you've got a piece that's $1,000, another that's $500, another that's $1,000, etc. The total combined cost, once you assemble all these together into your little kit, has to be $5,000 or more. And if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that it's marked in the budget justification that you're fabricating, because that's going to be one of the first questions us and pretty much anybody else who looks at the budget is going to ask. Is why do you have something in there that's less than $5,000? Oh, it's because you're fabricating something. And make sure when you're purchasing that you make sure that purchasing knows that you're fabricating something. The reason why is because anything under the equipment area of your budget doesn't have indirect cost calculated on it. A lot of people think that computers are equipment unless they're over $5,000 per item, which a lot of computers nowadays aren't. They're actually a materials and supply entry. Equipment can raise a red flag for people, and it's primarily what I mentioned about the fabricated equipment. If you have something in there that's under 5,000, that's going to raise a question about why is this under equipment. If you have something in there where you're putting more than one item, you might want to mention the per item cost on that. In travel, some of the things that they look at in travel are, it can include lodging or apartment rentals, local transportation. On mileage for federal proposals, we use the federal rate. If it's a state proposal, then you use the state rate, which is published an OU site under financial services. Registration fees, whether or not you can count those for a conference attendance, sometimes will vary by the sponsor's guidelines. Another interesting thing, if you're traveling to a country that's having security or safety issues, you can include things in your proposal such as guards or a driver to take you places, because it's not safe for you to be a driver. And there's a special note usually in the government's per diem chart that covers that is okay to include as part of your proposal. Travel to Canada or Mexico, depending on the sponsor, may not be foreign travel. It may be counted as domestic travel. So you need to look and see what the guidelines with your sponsor says in regards to that. It can raise a red flag, especially if you're traveling to a foreign country. You may have to provide special justification. Why do you feel the need for this proposed work that you're doing to travel to a foreign location? And it could be very simple. It could be, this is where your project is, or you need to go there to gather data, or there's a big international conference that you feel like you need to disseminate results at. You just have to provide the justification for where you're traveling. How much information you need to provide in the travel area when it comes to your budget justification varies from sponsor to sponsor. We are seeing that many sponsors are now requiring a lot more information than they did years ago. Instead of just putting a couple of sentences about, I want to travel to a domestic conference to present results, and I estimate it's going to cost $2,000, it's more likely that they're going to want something like an example of a conference that you might attend, a projection on, well, the location is probably going to be here because the last conference was on the East Coast, so now I think it's going to be on the West Coast. How you came up with those numbers, sometimes they want details like the flight cost, the per diem cost, how many days, how many people, and just every component that builds up what that travel cost is. You note where it says the Fly America Act. I should also mention the Buy America Act. So the federal sponsors want to try and keep money internal to the United States. And so they have prescripted on almost all federal awards that if you're going to fly, that you fly America. If you're going overseas, that can affect the cost of the tickets that you're looking at, because you might have a cheaper flight through another air carrier. So you want to keep that in mind when you're coming up with your cost projections. There are a few countries that have made agreements with the United States, such as England, where they're reciprocal on this. So you can fly on an English flight on a lot of these because the English people do the same thing. They're allowed to fly the American because they've made an agreement between the two countries. So participant support costs are agency specific. Some allow them and some don't. It's intended mainly for like conferences or workshops, training events, things like that. And it's not like for you to attend one. Travel?
Actually, this question about job descriptions. Are there standardized job descriptions or templates for job descriptions for things like project coordinator or project manager? And are these job descriptions tied to salary scales? How can I access this?
We do not have any job descriptions or rate of pay charts within ORS. So that would be up for you to check with HR to see if they have anything like that. And you might talk to other experienced PIs within your department. because if they've hired some before, they can tell you what pay ranges they used. Okay. So participant support. So it's not intended for conferences or meetings that you attend. The only caveat to that is if you're going to an NSF sponsored conference, there are a few cases where they will let you count participant support if you've got a group of people that you're getting together to go to attend that conference. If you're using participant support, it can't be used for employees. So for example, if you're putting together a workshop and Dr. Smith from a nearby department is going to come and attend this workshop too, because he's an employee of OU, he can't be counted in your participant numbers. You can still let him come, you just can't use him as a number when you're calculating your cost for putting on this workshop. Also, people who are coming to present at the workshop, if their primary purpose that they're coming is that they're going to be a presenter, then they're not a participant. They're a presenter, and their travel costs go under travel in your budget and not under participant support. If they're coming as a participant and all of a sudden, oh, you know, we just need you to do like a half an hour presentation because Dr. So-and-so got sick, you can count them as a participant because their primary cost in attending the conference or the workshop that you're doing was to be a participant. I would also note that if you have like grad students on the particular grant that has the participant support on it, those grad students, as part of being employed on the grant, are now employees, and so they also cannot count in your participant support numbers. They can still go to the conference or the workshop that you're planning, they just can't be counted as the numbers when you're calculating your cost. So some of the things you can include under here are stipends for the attendees. If you're looking at doing a conference for teachers, you can include a stipend for them, and you can also cover their substitute teachers that are covering the class for them. Transportation costs for the people coming in, housing if you have to put them up for a night or two at a hotel, subsistence, their per diem. If you're going to have any food or beverages provided as part of your workshop, they have to be working type of things. So like you might have some coffee or something like that in the morning, and you have like a box lunch or buffet lunch, and you're still meeting, like you have a speaker that comes in and talks while everybody's eating, or everybody stays on location to save time. You bring the meal in and everybody kind of networks and talks about whatever presentations they've had that morning. You have to include the number of participants that you use to calculate your cost. If it's an NSF proposal, we actually have to enter those participant numbers in the NSF budget form that's being submitted. Participant support cost raises a flag. It usually gets looked at closely not only by auditors, but also by the agencies that we're requesting the funds from, because participant support costs don't have any indirect costs calculated on them. So they want to make sure that they're being spent appropriately. Some agencies such as NSF also restrict how the funds can be handled. So for example, NSF, you can put a chunk of money in participant support, but once you put it there, you can't pull it back out and shift it to another part of the budget once you get the award. You have to have special permission to move any funds out of participant support, but you can put more money in. The reason why is they're trying to protect participant support. They don't want that to be the first thing that you cut if you have a budget revision, because for NSF, participant support can have a big impact on your funding, because one of their missions is to support training for undergraduates to bring along future scientists. And so they don't want you automatically cutting that all the time to the point that you don't have any training or anything going on related to your proposal. So the question is, could this include gifts for participants? No. Incentives for participant support actually go under other direct costs. And we talk more about that coming up. The only caveat to that, I would say, is if there is an organizational item. We have seen NSF and I think Department of Education approved things like when smart boards were first coming out, they had some workshops where they trained teachers on how to use the smart boards. And as part of the training and them attending the workshop, they got to take some smart board software or a smart board back to their school. And they did let them count that as a other support cost, but most normally incentives don't go here. And also, if you're doing like a study where you're like, you want to pay people like a $25 gift card or something like that to participate in a study, that is not participant support. Participant support is just educational training, workshops, and things like that. So there's a whole slew of other direct costs, and we're going to go through all of these item by item. It sounds kind of funny because when you look at that sheet, and keep in mind this is for most federal submissions, there is an other direct cost other category. So under your materials and supplies, these are some of the common items that we see here. Things like chemicals, expendable equipment like a DVM or a digital voltmeter, something that doesn't cost $5,000 per item. Software, computers, any gases or media that you have to have within the lab that you want to order a whole tank of helium to do this work. Cartridges for copiers, any other types of research supplies that you can think about. This would even include like if you were ordering mice or something like that you were going to use for experiments. Reference materials, and I mentioned any instruments, things under the $5,000. I want to mention on the computers, just about any place that you're going to be requesting funds for a computer, they're going to want to know a little bit about why you need a computer, because they consider that all the senior PIs who are requesting funds from them are probably have an office and they probably have a computer that's being supplied by their university. So why is it that you still need a computer for your project? Well, you may have a good reason. Maybe you need a computer for your postdoc or your grad student to use as they do the work for you on this proposal. Maybe you're going to be going off site someplace and you can't take your desktop with you. You need a laptop to take with you to collect data. So just say a sentence or two about why you think you need the computer to do the work. Publication costs, this includes like page charges if you have to pay a journal to do publications. It can also include like if you're going to a conference and you have to have a poster made to help do a presentation, or maybe you've got a postdoc or grad student who's going to do a poster presentation. So the cost for having the poster made or helping to have it made, that can be included. If you're doing humanities type of work and you're going to have some type of a brochure or a flyer handed out related to whatever your project is, that can also count on your publication cost. Computer services would be like if your department charges an IT fee, if you have to have a special web connection for the work that you're doing, or special IT support. Consultant services, this is someone that you're hiring for a short period of time to work on your proposal. It's usually some type of advice or a service for a fee type of thing that you're doing. We ask that you get some type of a letter or an email to document whatever the arrangement is that you've come up with. You don't have to turn that into ORS. We just think that it's a good policy for you to have one. So it might be something where like once you've concluded your discussions with Dr. Smith and he's agreed that he's going to work for 2 weeks for $5,000, you just send him an email and say, okay, I want to make sure we're on the same page. You've agreed to do blah, blah, blah for $5,000 and you're estimating it's going to take this much time. They respond back, yeah, that's what we agreed to. And you just hang on to that. We have seen it happen in more than one instance when it came time to award, that the person who was the consultant forgot the conversation that they had had entirely, where they had agreed to say $5,000, and now they want $10,000 or $15,000 for the work that's being proposed. So Like I said, we don't require that you turn that in. We just recommend that the PIs get that and they retain it in case it's needed in the future. There has been 1 or 2 cases where we've had a sponsor who wanted to see something similar to that in the submission paperwork. So you have to see what the sponsor guidelines ask for too. Usually a person who's a consultant is considered an independent contractor. So they have set themselves up to be able to accept funds on their own. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. It has to be an equitable charge based on what other people within their field would charge. So for example, normally a professor in geology would charge like $250 a day for their work. You can't come in and say the value of this person's time is $5,000 a day, because the people within your field are the ones who are going to be evaluating your budget, and they kind of know what's normal within your field. And so they'll recognize that this is a non-standard charge that you've got here. It does raise a red flag where it gets looked at closer by auditors and our office and sometimes the sponsors, because sometimes people will try and put funds under consultant that should really be a subcontract and vice versa, because they're trying to avoid paperwork. So subcontracts, I mentioned sometimes they'll raise a red flag. For a subcontract, we need a subcontract proposal, which would include like a statement of work where they say what they're going to do, a budget justification that explains their numbers, and an official letter of commitment from someone who has the authority to commit their university for the work that's being agreed to. A copy of their rate agreement or a link to where it's located if they have indirect costs that's being charged on their budget. So that's a standard subcontract package. It's not uncommon that the sponsor may not care about any of that subcontract package, that it's just our office that wants it. The sponsor may want to see like the letter of commitment or their budget justification or statement of work. The sponsor may want to see the whole package, and they may also want to have some type of a letter of commitment from the actual PI that says something about what they're particularly doing in support of the proposed work. So it kind of varies a lot from sponsor to sponsor. The reason why OU requires that you have this whole package from the subcontract is legally we can't say that we have the participation of company or university XYZ if we don't have this letter. We would be misrepresenting to the sponsor that we've made the arrangements for this person to be involved and their work to be conducted as part of the proposal. Tuition, if you have a graduate student on your proposal, you will automatically have tuition. You can't avoid it unless the sponsor specifically says that they do not allow tuition remission. Effective January 18, we shifted from doing our old rate, which was a 16% charge to the sponsor and then a 20% waiver from the grad college. If you or someone you know has an award that lasted several years that started back when we did the 1620, those have all been grandfathered so that we didn't have to change things like midstream with the new calculations. But effective January 18, we went to a monthly charge, and this was directed by the grad college. So if your budget finishes before June the 30th, 2020, the per month charge is $973 per GRA. After that, until they tell us different, it goes to $1,051 a month per GRA. It doesn't matter if they're on there half a month, a whole month, or 1 day. If they're on there even 1 day, they get charged for the whole month. You also can't appoint a GRA like and say they're going to be on here 9 months and they're going to fall under this policy, but for the summer I'm going to appoint them as an hourly person to avoid the tuition charge. On our website, there's a section for the policy on tuition remission, and as we get questions, we've been adding, we go to the dean of the grad college and get his answer for the question, and then we post it. So there's 4 or 5 questions that have been answered that are posted here that are really good to look at if you have questions about the GRA area. Some of the things that we see in the other area are communication costs, like FedEx and other mail charges, fax charges. If you have to have a cell phone because you're going to be working at a remote site, some sponsors will pay for that. You may have to have some type of a log where you track these were the business calls and these were the non-business calls to, or only use it for the business calls. If you put postage on, where you can't buy stamps, you have to use like metered mail. The reason why is because the federal government found that stamps were a highly pilferable item. So it's hard for people to keep track of, and so that's how come they make you use metered mail. If you're doing long distance phone call charges, then when you make your calls, you should make a note or a log about what the call, like the date and what the call was about, so that you have some type of a record to show that it was project related expenses. If you have animal or human care costs, this is where those go. This is also where incentives goes, and I think that's maybe on another one. Any construction or renovation costs related to your proposed work. And I'll also mention that when you do your information sheet, if you flag that renovations or space may be needed for your project, your proposal development person will get back with you and will ask some questions like, have you talked to this over with your chair or your dean? Because we have to have a letter from them where they know that they show that they're aware that they know that you getting this award is going to drive these renovation costs. If you're putting on a workshop or a conference that doesn't fall within the bounds of participant support, or if your sponsor doesn't allow participant support, then the cost for these workshops go in the other direct other category. And I would note that if you have any food cost related to a conference, you want to make sure that that is apparent in your budget justification. Some places will pay for them if you put it in the budget justification. Some won't. Even if you put it in the budget justification and they approve it, when it comes time to spend it, they'll turn it down then. Food is a high interest item, and you want to make sure that it's some type of a working meal. They look harder at dinner than they do breakfast and lunch, because it's very seldom that people will have a workshop or a conference that goes into the evening where a meal is being provided. Contracts and vendor services go under here, and you have a decision matrix, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. The question had come up before about incentives. This is where your payments for incentives go. And don't be surprised if you have incentives or gift cards is what's normally used, because cash is really hard to track. And so gift cards are most normally used. There are policies that the financial support services has in relationship to incentives and gift cards. And usually your proposal development person will send you a link to that so that you have a heads up on what their requirements are. If you're going to be doing testing like DNA testing or microscopy, things like that, where they charge you a fee to do the test, that's where these charges go. A lot of federal sponsors nowadays want you to have some type of an evaluation of your project, either external or they won't specify. If they don't provide a special place in their budget to put these, then you normally we'll see those under other direct cost other. Any advertising that you have, web construction cost. So I didn't cover that. Okay, we'll cover that later. So those are pretty much all the direct cost categories. So now we're almost down to the bottom of your spreadsheet there. So we're looking at the F&A, or the indirect cost. The F&A costs are set by negotiation. We negotiate with the Department of Health and Human Services. We have more than one rate, and we'll go over that in a minute. PIs cannot negotiate an indirect cost rate with anyone. If you have a sponsor who asks for a certain rate to be applied, or that tells you that they only pay 12% or something like that, you want to give that information to your proposal development specialist, and we will try and help work it out with them. Sometimes if they have a restriction, we can use it if it's something that's established, like in the solicitation, and sometimes we can't. If they have a rate that is set that they publish in the solicitation, or that is like posted on their website, it's been approved by like their board of directors, then usually we will allow that to be applied. You're always free, if they have a reduced IDC, to ask the BPR if they will cover the difference between what would normally be charged and the amount that the sponsor is asking you to pay. And I wanted to mention, because you'll see this on the information sheet, it'll ask you about flow-through funds. So what they're talking about there is, when we talk about our sponsor, that is who is giving us the money, who's giving OU the money. But there could be a sponsor farther up the chain. So for example, we might be getting money from Oklahoma State University, but Oklahoma State University is getting the money for the project from NSF. So it's flowing from NSF to OSU to OU. So that's considered flow-through funding. It's very common for companies to have unusual indirect cost agreements. They call it overhead or profit. It's also not uncommon to find out that it is 100%, 120%, 200%. There are occasions sometimes where a company will not release their indirect cost rate because they consider it to be proprietary. Even though the solicitation that you have says that that information has to be provided with the proposal, they know that this happens, and the way that it works is you put in whatever the company tells you to put in for that amount, and if it gets awarded, then the federal government goes directly back to that company, and the company provides the information to the federal government, and we never see it. If you have a foreign entity that's on your proposal that's requesting indirect cost, some sponsors will allow it and some won't. It's very common also that if they do allow it, they will restrict it to like 8% or 10%. There are a few sponsors that allow a fee on top of the direct and indirect cost charges. For example, some of the Department of Education proposals will have a fee entry on the bottom. OU does not do that because we're nonprofit, so we don't add any extra costs or fee to the proposal. There is a rate that sponsors can use who don't have an indirect cost rate that this is, for example, foundations. So like if you had a foundation or an agency on your proposal that didn't have an indirect cost rate, you could tell them, hey, by the way, if you don't have an indirect cost rate, you can ask for 10% because the federal principles say that you can have at least 10%, and we don't argue that. If they say they don't have an indirect cost rate agreement, but they're claiming the 10% federal de minimis, then we allow them to have that because the federal government says we have to. There are a lot of different kinds of indirect cost rates that can be applied. And I mention this because you may see these as you do business with other organizations. So the one that we use is called modified total direct cost. So we take all of the direct cost, add them all together, take out the equipment, the tuition, and any facilities rental, and that gives us what's called our base. And that's what our calculations are made on. Some schools just use salary and fringe. I think Tulsa University is one of those. We do have more than one rate We have a research rate, which is 55%. We have an other sponsored projects activity, which is 36.3%. We have off-campus, which most universities do, which is 26%. Some institutions may apply more than one rate to their budget. So that's also something that you might see if you're working with other organizations. So I mentioned before at OU, our cognizant agency is DHHS. They're the ones that we negotiate with every few years to get our rate. Our last agreement was negotiated for the indirect cost on 6/4/18. This past spring, we actually had an update to fringe. If you want to request other sponsored activity off campus or the state agency rate, your proposal development person has a form that you can fill out where you request that rate. And they have to be approved before you can apply them in your project. At OU, we don't use more than one rate in a budget. So it's like, we don't calculate, so 10% of your budget's going to be OSA rate and 90% of your budget's going to be research rate. Some institutions do that. They ask you to break the budget up like that. We don't. Whatever the majority of your work qualifies for, that's the rate that's applied to your whole proposal. If you're doing business with a company, it's very seldom that a non-full rate will be approved for work that's done with a company. I've seen it happen a couple times. Mainly it was because they were going to be submitting beyond themselves, like they were submitting to NSF. The reason why is because OU is a state agency, and so we don't want it to be said that we as a state agency are subsidizing or helping out another company, because a similar company in that same venue of work could claim that they're getting preferential treatment or a benefit from the state. So now you've come to the bottom of your spreadsheet, and this is where we do all of the calculations to figure out what the sponsor is being asked to pay for. You'll notice kind of towards the right side, so not the yellow area here, but these columns right here. This first column, that's how much we're asking the sponsor to pay for. So when all the calculations are done, that's how much we're asking the sponsor to pay for. This is cost share by OU, which sometimes the sponsor may ask for and sometimes they may not. But if it's in your proposal, we want to know, because we may have to track it internally for audit reasons. And then this column here, that is your total cost, the sponsor and the cost share. So be careful what you're looking at, because it's very common that PIs will look at this last column and think they're looking at the total cost of what they're asking for the sponsor, and that's not the case. You want to look at that first column. That's what you're asking from the sponsor. So some other things that you want to keep in mind. Who's going to be doing what in your proposal, and is the staffing going to change over time? So example of this, normally we say that you should have at least a 3% cost of living increase between years, so that when and if you get a pay raise, that's already calculated. If you don't get a pay raise, then you have a little extra money that you can shift to supplies or something else. But if you don't project any changes in your budget over the life of the project, and a pay raise or a fringe rate, which fringes change almost every year, changes, you have to pay people at what they're appointed. So that means you either have to reduce their effort on that project, or you've got to take funds from someplace else to cover any increases in salary or fringe. So that's how come we recommend that you put the 3% in. You're not required to. You can put more, you can put less, you can have none. That's entirely up to you as the PI. Another thing to consider on the staffing needs changing is that, let's say you put a grad student on there and you have a 5-year project, you might have the same grad student for a couple of years, but at some point, maybe that grad student is going to drop off, or maybe they're going to change to a postdoc or something. So you might escalate for a couple of years, and then you're going to drop back because you're starting a new grad student. So you want to keep that in your mind. what is the project period, and does this affect the personnel that are appointed and the budget? So for example, you know that if I do a submission to NSF, it's going to usually be 6 months before they come back and they tell me that it's going to be funded. So I'm going to set my budget up so that it goes from January to December. Well, in January, if I get funded starting in January, how quickly am I going to be able to find a grad student to work on this project? I might not be able to find a grad student to work on it until after the summer. So I don't need a grad student projected for that whole first year. I just need one projected for the last semester. So that's one of the things you have to think about in your timing. Are there any resources available nearby that you could use? So for example, there might be some test equipment in another department. We actually have an office within the VPR that can help tell you if there's special large pieces of test equipment scattered around the university. There might be things available at HSC that you could utilize, or OMRF. So think about what might be in the vicinity around you, because not only does that save you money in your budget, but you can explain that in your facilities and other resources, and the evaluators will know that you've taken the time to look around the area to see what's available that you can use to support your project. And I mentioned the cost of living already. Are there special budget forms needed by the sponsor or submissions that are needed in the routing? One of the things that we do is we require that you use the OU internal spreadsheet, which this is one of the formats. There's another one that's similar. But we will do the form for you that gets submitted, so you don't have to do 2 budgets, because we know that's a pain. The only caveat to that is if the sponsor requires like a tasking or a phase listing, which it would be impossible for us to know what your tasks are. So then you would have to be more involved in doing the sponsor's forms for that if the sponsor is requiring it. Your budget justification is your narrative on how the funds need to be spent. We talk some about travel. In supplies, they may want to know quantities, descriptions. It's not uncommon, especially if you're doing a submission to Department of Energy or Department of Defense, that they'll want to know the basis of cost. So how did you come up with that? Was it prior experience? Was it that you looked online? Did you have a catalog? How did you come up with that information? If you're looking at getting equipment, it's not uncommon that they'll want to see a quote or to know where you got the price for the equipment that you're looking at. Some sponsors want a justification for each year of the budget. Some are happy with just an overview of the whole budget. Sometimes they want just an overview and an example explanation of differences that are occurring between years. A sponsor may want a budget depicted in more than one manner. So for example, if you're doing a NASA submission, usually you have to fill out their form online, which we will help do. You have a redacted budget that goes with your narrative project description portion. They also want a total budget, which is everything on the budget, all the budget justifications and everything as a total budget attachment. Depending on what specific arm of NASA you're dealing with, they may want that in fiscal years, they may want it in real years, they may want it in calendar years, they may want it in all 3. So you have to read the solicitation carefully and look at how many different ways they want the budget depicted. If you're doing Department of Energy, it's not uncommon that they'll want the budget in federal fiscal years. So like they'll have like a 4-month budget, a 12-month budget, a 12-month budget, and then an 8-month budget. That would be a 3-year spending period, because the first quarter is where the fiscal year starts, October to December. Then you have 2 full years, and then you have the October through September spending. So I think we go through each of these. Yeah. No? Okay. So common issues. You have a handout for how to make a decision on whether or not you have a consultant versus a vendor. So we get questions about this a lot. And if you just go through the different areas on this and kind of check if, like, get in your mind who you're thinking might be your subcontract or who you think might be a consultant, and see which of these columns most of their checks occur in. The big difference between a consultant and a subcontract is that your subcontract person is going to be someone who's going to help with publications, and they're going to be like one of your co-authors, and they help make programmatic decisions. A vendor is someone that they sell to anybody off the street. So anybody can come and get the same or similar things from them. A consultant is someone who's usually only involved in a minor way. It may be critical to the project, what they're providing, but they may not be involved in programmatic decisions and things like that. Also note that it varies from proposal to proposal. So you could have a university on proposal A that they're a subcontract because of how heavily they're involved in the proposal. But in proposal B, they're just going to run some tests for you, which they have a service center that charges for those tests. So on proposal B, they're just a vendor. So you have to look at what your relationship is to them based on the work that they're going to be doing to support your proposal. You have to watch consultants that are retired. If they're from OU, they have to go a certain time period between the time they retire to when they can actually be a consultant, or they could choose not to be a consultant and they can still be as other personnel on your proposal. If it's someone outside of OU and they mention that they're retired, you want to mention to them that they want to make sure that they check with their company or their organization to make sure that what they're getting paid is not going to exceed the parameters of what they're allowed or have a negative impact on their retirement income. If you provide a stipend or a fellowship for students, that has particular ramifications for IRS on what you can have them do or not do. If you are requiring them to be at the lab at certain times or to turn in anything like reports and things like that, then it's actually a work relationship that you have with them because you're expecting something in exchange for the money that you're giving them. So a fellowship is free and clear. They don't have to check in with you or meet certain requirements from you to get the money. It's very common that sometimes you'll be in discussions with other organizations as you're trying to come to an agreement on who's going to be involved in a proposal, either you as a subcontract or with subcontracts that you're working with. You will need to be careful when you start talking budget figures with people to make sure that you include the correct fringe rates and IDC rates. So when you get to the point that you're starting to talk numbers, you need to be talking with someone in ORS to make sure you're using the correct figures. And I would caution you to also think about this on your subcontracts, because when you get to the point that you're talking to your friends that are going to be working on the proposal with you, you want to raise the question, have you ran this through your ORS? Because they may say, oh yeah, I can do that for $50,000. And then when you get to the final stages of pulling the proposal together and they finally go to their ORS, they find out, oh, there's IDC on this and it's going to be $75,000 and not 50. And so that throws all of your budget plans out the window and you've kind of got to start over. Foreign entity, and not just foreign entity, but foreign travel is a big audit issue right now and probably will be for the next several years. So anything foreign that you have that you're going to be doing, you want to make sure that you have it well justified in your proposal. And you want, if you're doing any foreign travel, you want to make sure that it's cleared with the sponsor before you make those trips. Some sponsors want any travel cleared, especially if it's for conference attendance. USGS is one of those. Any travel has to be cleared before it happens. Cost share is an issue that we have, so we'll go into that a little bit. So there are 3 types of cost share. Involuntarily committed is also called mandatory cost share. That's where the solicitation will actually tell you, you have to have 20% or 1-to-1. For every $1 that you get from us, you're going to have to provide $1. So this is where the sponsor is requiring that you provide a certain amount of cost share. Voluntary committed is when the institution or the PI says that they're going to provide cost share, and they quantify it. So the big thing is the quantification. So if you put in a proposal and you mention in the budget justification, I'm going to spend 20% of my time at no cost to the sponsor on this project. The sponsor can say, 20% of their time, we can calculate the value of that. We're going to claim that as cost share. Now your PDS will try and catch that for you, but if we've got 40 proposals going in the same day and everybody gives us their stuff at the last minute, chances are we're going to miss that. When it comes in for the award, you'll have to find out, can I really cough up that 20%, or is that going to overextend me in other commitments that I have made, or do we have to go back to the sponsor and negotiate and try and get them to take all or part of that off? Voluntary uncommitted is when you say you're going to do something for the proposal, or that your department's going to provide something, and you don't quantify it. So like our example on the 20% time, all the PI would have to do is say something along the lines of, I will spend additional time at no cost to the sponsor on ensuring that the objectives for this proposal are accomplished. Because it's not quantified, it can't be collected or as cost share. NASA is the only sponsor, federal sponsor that I know of that has a work effort table that they want submitted that has a special note on it that says whatever that you put on there for work effort will not be counted as cost share. There are times that we track cost share internally that's not reported to the sponsor. A good example that was in the old, under the old calculations, that 20% tuition that was provided by the grad college. We used to track that internally to make sure that the grad college had those funds set back, but we didn't report it to a sponsor unless they asked for cost share. If you mention, especially in the budget or the budget justification, or in the body of the proposal, any quantified cost share, a sponsor can collect it and at award ask that it be monitored and provided as part of the conditions of the award. You all heard of the GeoCard proposal that got awarded a while back ago. In the body of the proposal, they mentioned it was either $60,000 or $80,000 worth of cost share that was going to be provided. That got picked up. We had to provide it and track it. If they say in the guidelines that they recommend that cost share be provided, or if they say sometimes under the review criteria, they'll say something about points will be given if cost share is provided or something like that. We kind of almost look at that in our office as it's kind of required. So we won't fight you on, okay, I think I need to have 5 or 10% effort on this to show that I'm meeting this cost share stuff. Otherwise, we're probably going to question you as to why you're providing it. And if you're providing a whole lot, we're going to encourage you to cut back on what you're providing or to unquantify it so that it doesn't have to be tracked. Because if it has to be tracked and turned in, it's an audit issue. Every entry that you make is something that the auditors can check the calculations on to see if you calculated it correctly, and they can check to see if it was turned in and reported. The template that we have for the budget is NSF. NSF does not allow cost share at all. It will cause your proposal to be rejected if you put it in there in any area but facilities and other resources. The only exception to that is if you're doing a major research instrumentation proposal where they have required cost share of 30%. So you can't mention anything about providing anything for an NSF proposal except in your facilities and other resources. And even in that area where you mention something like maybe the department's going to have a grad student who's going to work on this proposal with you, you mention it in your other resources just to show institutional support, but you still don't quantify it. You don't say a GRA at 20% effort at $32,000 a year is going to be provided by the department. You just simply say that as additional institutional support, the department's going to provide a GRA to help do these components of the proposal. Dun, 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 dun. I mentioned that. If you're on a 9-month appointment, normally OU will not let you cost share time in the summer because you're not on contract with OU during the summer. So it becomes a problem with us trying to track and monitor that it's reported. If you have cost share that's coming from outside the university, let's say that you're doing a proposal and OG&E is going to have one of their technicians work with you on the proposal, you can get a letter from OG&E that they put a value on it that says this person's time is worth $40,000, and we can take that as third-party cost share. So this is very handy, especially we've had a lot of people lately doing Department of Energy submissions, and a lot of times they require a 20% cost share. Third-party cost share from a company is really good to help meet that requirement. Another very common one that we see a lot of third-party cost share on are the OCAS submissions. I can't tell you what the acronym stands for, but it's a state department, and they have a research type of proposal that goes out that requires one-to-one cost share, and they won't let you take in-kind salary if you're on a normal faculty state appointment. So it's very hard to come up with the cost share for that unless you've got startup funds where you're going to spend it for travel or supplies that you can claim for that. And even a lot of startup funds are coming from state appropriated funds, so you can't count those. So it's very common to try and have a company that's involved in the proposal on those to help meet the cost share. So sources for cost share, it's very common unless the sponsor limits it that in-kind time from the PI is going to be used, like 2% or 5% of your time over 4 months or 9 months. Sometimes your department or your college might contribute funds for like travel or to help pay for a grad student or some supplies. You can go to the vice president for research and ask them for some funds. It's usually if the vice president or the provost is going to help provide funds, they want to see that the PI in the department is also providing a share of the funds to meet whatever the cost share is. We mentioned the third-party contributors. If you have a subcontract, we expect the organizations involved in the subcontract to bear their share of the load. So if they're asking for $100,000 in their budget and there's a cost share commitment of 20% required, we expect them to provide their 20% for that $100,000. Now, if they have trouble meeting that requirement and you have a third-party company who's willing to provide all the cost share for your proposal, we can usually work things out and let the company provide it for them. The Regents for Higher Education also provides some cost share in certain cases, mainly related to student support and tuition and things like that. If a sponsor restricts our indirect costs, like they say we can only have 30%, many times they will let us count the difference between 30% and 55%, that unrecovered amount. They let us sometimes count that as part of our cost share package. If we cost share, say like you donated 5% of your time, we count the 5% of your time plus the fringe that's tied to that. And if the sponsor didn't say we couldn't, we also count IDC on that, because had the organization or sponsor been paying for your time, they would have also paid for the IDC. So it's not uncommon. For example, I mentioned DOE has that 20% requirement. Most of the time, unless you're asking for a huge amount of money, that 20% can be met by the PI and the co-PI doing a little bit of time because of the fringe and the unrecovered that's added. So don't automatically assume when you're looking at an RFP and it has cost share that you might have trouble coming up with it. Talk with your PDS and do some number crunching and see, because it might not be as bad as you think it's going to be. The sponsor can sometimes limit what you can include in your cost share package. For example, if you're going to include equipment, a lot of times they will say the equipment can't already have been purchased. It has to be purchased after the start date of the proposal. Or they may say that the equipment has to be valued at its current value and usage rate. So you have to do like a formula, like I paid this much for it, it depreciates this much every year, I'm only going to use it for 50% of the time on this year. So it gets kind of involved, and it usually comes out that you only have $2,000 or $3,000 per year on equipment. We mentioned the contributed F&A, and the Regents matching funds. When you're working on your budget, especially the first few times that you use the OU spreadsheet, feel free to come to ORS, make an appointment with your PDS, and we'll sit down with you and go through like making a draft budget together with you. And you can come over as often as you want to do one, but most of the time, by the time you do it a couple times, you kind of have figured out how the spreadsheet works. It's also not uncommon that we'll have PIs who'll say, can you put 2 months of salary down, a grad student for this amount, this much of supplies, and we'll plug those numbers into a draft budget for you to get you started. You can ask, there's a lot of different places you can ask for help. I just mentioned those up there in the slides, but keep in mind that ORS is your only official place that can help you with the budget, or the budget that we help you develop or that we approve is the only official budget. So for example, if you're working with HSC and the HSC PI or some research people at HSC say, hey, I'll do the budget for you. Well, that's all fine and good, but it's not going to save you any time, because we're going to have to sit down and develop the budget ourselves with you, because you're the one that has to answer the audit questions on it if it gets audited. You got to know how the funds are going to be spent. So it doesn't help you to have somebody else tell you what you're going to have in your budget. And they don't know what our current rates are. They may know what our indirect cost rate is, because that doesn't change very often, but our fringe rate changes almost every year. So a lot of times we find if someone else helps you develop your budget, it usually ends up costing you time because we just have to redo it. After you've put in your proposal and the program officer gets back with you, it's not uncommon that they ask you to revise the budget. And while I have seen a couple of times where they have increased the amount that you've asked for, that's pretty rare. So usually they're going to ask you to cut. Usually it's 10 to 20%. If they do ask you to revise your budget, you want to keep in mind when you're making those revisions, you usually have to provide some type of an impact statement or new justification. You don't want to just take the budget cut and not say that something changed in your statement of work or your objectives. Because if they come back and they say cut 20% of your budget and you say, okay, I'm fine, I'll take this money and I'll run with it, and that's all you say, they assume that the first budget that you put in was a lie. You're not changing anything. You haven't told them how you're going to come up with the difference. You're just taking the money and running. So you want to go back and say, I'm going to come up with the difference in this by my department is going to allow me to have an extra GRA part-time to help do this. Or I'm going to provide another $4,000 out of my startup funds to help pay for the travel that I'm cutting. Or I need to modify my statement of work or take off this objective or task in order to be able to do the work that you want me to do for the budget that you're allowing. I also want to mention the burn rate. That's how quickly you're spending your funds. This is also another item that's looked at pretty closely by a lot of the sponsors and has been for the last couple of years. So how fast you're spending your money, or that you're even spending your money, is something that they look at, because that's part of managing the budget for your proposal. So even if you have a temporary account set up to post charges to that your department works with ORS to set up, you still want to look at getting things set up so that you're charging things correctly and that you're actually spending your funds. You can usually get a no-cost extension from most federal sponsors on a yearly basis or overall on the project. I say usually. Sometimes they don't approve it. So don't go into your budget thinking, oh, I'm automatically going to get a no-cost extension. There are some sponsors who have said, and ONR is one of them, that they are going away from no-cost extensions because they feel that if you have to ask for one, it shows you can't manage your funds. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions? Lots.